Chapter 1: The Consensus Menu. The air in the lobby of the Cineplex aggregate smelled of synthetic butter, stale carpet, and ionized ozone. It was the smell of industrial-grade escapism, heavy enough to coat the back of the throat. Elian stood before the selection terminal, the illuminated screen reflecting twin pale blue squares in his tired eyes. Beside him, his younger brother, Jax, shifted his weight, his sneakers squeaking rhythmically on the polished linoleum. Jax was vibrating with a restless, jagged energy that Elian knew would flag the biometric scanners if he didn't calm down. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say that the system wasn't already actively monitoring. Elian pressed his thumb against the glass scanner. A sharp prick of red light mapped his capillary flow, cross-referencing it with his current neurostability index. The terminal processed for a second, humming a low, discordant note before populating his personalized menu. It was a pathetic selection. Tier 4 clearance. Infrastructure maintenance protocol. Sector 9 romantic comedy. Crop yield stabilization narrative historical drama. Seasonal weather pattern adjustment animated family adventure. Safe films. Stabilizers. Movies designed for minds that needed to be lulled into a shallow, agreeable alpha state. The goal for Tier 4s wasn't to pioneer new aspects of reality. It was to act as psychic ballast, to gently reinforce the mundane consensus that kept the bridges from dissolving and the gravity constant. Elian chose the romantic comedy. He hated them, but the city engineers had been issuing warnings about microfractures in the Sector 9 aqueducts for weeks. The collective emotional swells of a million people watching two attractive ladies overcome contrived misunderstandings was usually enough psychic mortar to patch the concrete for another fiscal quarter. He glanced sideways. Jax was staring at his own terminal, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle feathered beneath his ear. Jax's screen was almost entirely grayed out. His clearance was slipping. He was listed as a Tier 2, high volatility, high creative output, but his recent chaotic REM cycles had flagged him as a liability. The system wasn't offering him the hard stuff anymore. The deep space physics documentaries, or the abstract horrors used to generate quantum computing breakthroughs. Jax raised a trembling finger and pointed to a title that was barely legible beneath a heavy red, restricted overlay. Ontological Breach, the Paradox Initiative. Elian just shook his head slowly. A sharp negative. If Jax forced entry into that screening, with his mind in its current frayed state, he wouldn't just disrupt the narrative flow. He could cause a localized hemorrhage. A glitch where the viewers exited the theater to find the parking lot asphalt turned to glass, or the sky the color of dead television static. Jax dropped his hand. The fight drained out of him, replaced by a sullen, terrifying emptiness. He jabbed a finger at an unrestricted title, generic resource allocation, action/thriller. A mindless explosion fest meant to burn off excess testosterone in the populace so they wouldn't riot in the streets. A waste of Jax's potent, chaotic mind. The machine spit out 2 ticket stubs. They weren't paper, they were thin wafers of conductive graphene, warm to the touch. They walked toward the corridor of theaters. The usher at the podium wasn't a teenager looking at their phone. It was a licensed psych tech in a sterilized uniform, their eyes hidden behind mirrored glasses that were actively scanning pupil dilation. The tech took Elian's ticket, scanned it, and nodded dismissively. They took Jax's ticket, held it for a beat longer, tilting their head as if listening to a frequency only they could hear. Finally, they stepped aside. Theater 7. Calibration begins in 4 minutes. Do not resist the auditory saturation. The tech's voice was flat and rehearsed. They stepped past the threshold. The transition was immediate. The air pressure dropped, popping Elian's ears. The ambient noise of the lobby, the hum of slushy machines, the murmur of the pre-show crowd, vanished instantly, swallowed by acoustic paneling thick enough to absorb a jet engine blast. The auditorium was vast and cavernous, curved like the inside of a womb or a bomb shelter. The seats were plush, designed to grip the body, outfitted with subtle restraints disguised as armrests. It was already 80% full. Hundreds of people sat in perfect silence, facing the massive, dead white screen. There was no chatter, no crunching of popcorn. This wasn't leisure. This was civic duty. They were the rendering engine of the world, waiting to be booted up. Elian and Jax found their assigned seats in the middle row, the sweet spot for auditory convergence. They sat down, the restraints whirred softly, tightening just enough to be noticeable. "Stay anchored," Elian murmured, the only words he had spoken since they left their apartment cubicle. Jax didn't respond. He was staring at the blank screen with a hunger that made Elian's stomach turn. The lights didn't dim, they were extinguished, plunging the room into an absolute, sensory-depriving blackness. For a moment, there was nothing. Then the sound began. It wasn't music. It was a sub-bass tone so deep it bypassed the ears entirely and resonated in the bone marrow. It was the carrier wave, the synchronization frequency, designed to align the heart rates of 500 individuals into a single, coherent rhythm. A single point of blinding white light ignited in the projection booth behind them. The beam cut through the darkness above their heads, thick with dust motes that swirled like newborn galaxies. The projector whirred to life. It wasn't just projecting images. It was opening a valve, preparing to flood the chamber with a guided hallucination strong enough to overwrite the world outside. The film began. Chapter 2, the live render. The movie did not exist until the audience looked at it. On the screen, a man in a beige trench coat bumped into a woman carrying a stack of digital slates. They tumbled to the simulated pavement, the slates scattering in a perfectly calculated array of clumsiness. It was standard rom-com template 4B. Elian watched the man apologize, but his attention wasn't on the dialogue. He was watching the lighting. To the general public, this process was marketed as effective stewardship. The official brochures claimed that gathering in theaters to experience synchronized narratives fostered civic empathy, reducing crime and stabilizing the social mood. Most of the 500 people in Theater 7 genuinely believed they were just participating in a mandatory wellness exercise. They thought the movie was a pre-recorded file meant to relax them. They didn't know they were compiling the physical world in real time. The projector at the back of the room held no reels and stored no data. It was simply a massive, multi-threaded biometric compiler. The armrests of their seats monitored heart rates, galvanic skin response, and cortical firing patterns, feeding that data into a central algorithm. The algorithm then generated the next frame of the film to perfectly match and gently guide the aggregate emotional state of the room. Right now, the algorithm needed to generate a baseline frequency of mild structural optimism. If the audience collectively believed that the man and woman on screen could resolve their awkward tension and build a stable relationship, that focused, synchronized belief was harvested. It was piped directly out of the theater and into the city's failing infrastructure. Belief became physics. The Sector 9 aqueducts held together not because of rebar and concrete, but because 500 minds in Theater 7 were currently being tricked into manifesting the concept of stability. Elian felt the gentle, rhythmic pull of the narrative algorithm trying to sync with his limbic system. It was a dull, warm sensation behind his eyes. He let himself fall into it, offering his mundane compliance to the machine. But next to him, Jax was a closed circuit. The man and woman on screen began to laugh, a scripted moment of connection. The ambient lighting in the scene shifted to a warm, golden hour amber. Suddenly, the amber flickered. It cooled instantly to a harsh, fluorescent green. Elian tensed against his restraints. He glanced at his brother. Jax's eyes were locked on the screen, unblinking, his breathing shallow and rapid. Jax wasn't receiving the narrative, he was pushing back against it. In a room of 500 Tier 4 minds generating compliant static, Jax's dormant Tier 2 intellect was a localized gravity well. The rendering algorithm was designed to follow the path of least resistance to achieve emotional consensus. But Jax's subconscious was too loud, too dense with unspent creative terror. The algorithm, operating purely on feedback, began to cater to the strongest signal in the room. On screen, the romantic comedy began to rot. The man in the beige coat stopped laughing. His smile froze, stretching just a millimeter too wide, lingering for 3 frames too long. The woman's digital slates, scattered on the pavement, subtly rearranged themselves into a pattern that resembled a jagged, fractured fault line. The background extras, meant to be out-of-focus pedestrians, all stopped walking and turned their heads to stare directly into the camera lens. A low murmur rippled through the theater. The audience was getting confused. Their heart rates were spiking, pivoting from structural optimism to collective unease. The feedback loop was reversing. Instead of the movie steering the audience, Jax was using the audience as an amplifier to steer the movie. Elian felt the air pressure in the theater drop drastically. The faint smell of synthetic butter was abruptly replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of ozone and crushed concrete. It wasn't just the movie that was changing. If Jax forced the algorithm to render a tragedy, if he manipulated these 500 minds into a state of synchronized dread, the system would output that frequency. Somewhere outside in Sector 9, the reinforced concrete of the aqueducts would respond to the new consensus. It would begin to crack. Jax, Elian whispered, his voice barely cutting through the sub-bass frequency, humming in the floorboards. Drop the thread. You're going to crash the local grid. Jax didn't move. A thin line of blood ran from his left nostril. He was live-coding the narrative with pure paranoia, and the projector was aggressively rendering his nightmare into reality. Chapter 3, The Descent. The screen was no longer a romance. It was an ontological hemorrhage. The simulated pavement on the screen fractured, revealing a scrolling, vertical abyss of raw, uncompiled light. The 500 minds in the auditorium were trapped in Jax's feedback loop, their collective heartbeat accelerating into a frantic, rhythmic thud. They were no longer generating the mortar for the Sector 9 aqueducts. They were tearing it apart, atom by atom, driven by the sheer, terrifying gravity of Jax's subconscious. Elian's chest tightened against the restraints. If the psych techs in the monitoring booths isolated Jax's biometric signature, it wouldn't just mean a fine or a tier downgrade. It meant the ultimate sanction. It meant exile. Elian stared into the harsh, flickering green light spilling from the screen, terrified of becoming an unrendered. To be permanently banned from the cinemas was to be excommunicated from the operating system of the world. The exiled were forced to wander a city that no longer acknowledged their version of the past. If the collective consensus voted a bridge out of existence during a Tuesday matinee, an exile would still try to walk across it on Wednesday, only to plummet into the river, screaming about a structure that, mathematically and physically, had never been built. They were ghosts locked in an outdated iteration of the universe. But the architectural gaslighting wasn't the cruelest part. It was the isolation. Inside the higher-tier theaters, the rendering engine didn't just warp space, it bent time. The density of synchronized consciousness created a local relativistic dilation. Elian had heard the whispers of what happened in the Tier 1 calibration chambers. The doors would lock for 2 physical hours, but the audience inside would be subjected to a shared, simulated narrative that lasted for years. They lived entire lifetimes in the dark. They fought imaginary wars together, built theoretical empires, and raised phantom children within the span of a single afternoon. When the lights finally came up, those audiences emerged bound by a profound, impenetrable brotherhood, carrying the heavy, nostalgic grief of decades of shared subjective history. Society was glued together by these phantom epochs. To be exiled meant being trapped in the agonizing, linear drip of standard time. It meant watching your peers live 100 lifetimes while you simply aged, hollow and utterly alone, cut off from the temporal warmth of the collective dream. Jax, Elian hissed, his fingers digging into the armrests. Stop, they'll lock us out. We'll be distanced. Jax didn't blink. His pupils were completely dilated, swallowing the iris. The thin line of blood from his nose had reached his chin. But beneath the strain, there was a terrible, euphoric clarity on his face. He wasn't just breaking the film out of adolescent rebellion. He was looking for something. He was hunting for the seam. It's a cage, Elian, Jax whispered, his voice vibrating with a dual resonance, as if he were speaking both aloud and directly into Elian's auditory cortex. The infrastructure, the weather, the gravity, they're using our minds to render a prison so we don't see what's outside. Jax pushed harder. Elian felt the psychic shockwave roll through the room. The 500 civilians gasped in unison, their limbs rigid. On the screen, the abyss of uncompiled light widened. The actors were gone, replaced by a swirling, fractal geometry that hurt to look at. Jax was peeling back the illusory layer of the demiurge's cinema, slicing through the polite fiction of the romantic comedy to expose the raw, terrifying machinery of the base reality beneath. He wasn't trying to crash the grid. He was trying to open a window. Suddenly, the sub-bass frequency humming through the floorboards stuttered. The projector at the back of the room let out a sound like a dying animal, a sharp, mechanical screech of a system failing to contain a paradox. The screen shattered into a blinding, featureless white. And for a fraction of a second, before the emergency overrides kicked in, Elian looked into the light and saw what Jax was pointing at. Chapter 4, The Bifurcation. The absolute whiteout of the shattered screen was instantly violently replaced by the staccato rhythm of emergency strobes. The acoustic dampening in Theater 7 failed, and the heavy, pneumatic hiss of the rear doors breaching sounded like a vacuum seal snapping. The psych techs moved with the synchronized, terrifying fluidity of white blood cells swarming an infection. They didn't run, they flowed down the carpeted aisles in their sterilized gray tactical gear, mirrored visors reflecting the fractured, pulsing red light of the alarm state. They hit the middle row in seconds. Two of them grabbed Elian, their gloved hands locking onto his shoulders with hydraulic force. Three more converged on Jax, but as the lead tech reached for Jax's collar, he made a fatal error. He glanced past Jax's shoulder and looked directly at the residual afterimage burning on the dead screen. He looked at the window Jax had ripped into the consensus reality. The tech stopped dead. The narration of the world seemed to violently contract around this single man's face. His mirrored visor slid down, revealing eyes that were oscillating wildly in their sockets, trying to track a geometry that did not belong in 3 dimensions. His jaw unhinged slightly, but no sound came out. It wasn't standard panic. It was a total ontological collapse rendered in flesh. The muscles in his cheeks spasmed as his brain tried, and completely failed, to compile the raw, infinite data of the outside. He began to suffocate, his throat constricting around the sudden, crushing realization that his entire life, his uniform, his physics, were just a thin membrane of lies. He dropped to his knees, clawing at his own throat, drowning in the truth. The rest of the squad hesitated, the synchronization of the hive mind momentarily severed by their captain's localized madness. Then the tech holding Elian's left arm spoke. He was a massive wall of a man, built thick with muscle and armor. But when he opened his mouth, the voice that emerged was a flawless, digitally smooth maternal contralto, a woman's voice, perfectly calm and deeply resonant. The structural integrity is gone, the woman's voice echoed from the giant's throat. "Get out, both of you." Now the grip on Elian's shoulders vanished. Elian stumbled forward into the aisle, pulling Jax with him. The theater was in pandemonium. The 500 rendered civilians trapped in their restraints, screaming as their shared hallucination dissolved into static. At the front of the sloped auditorium, flanking the massive, dead screen, were 2 emergency exits. Standard architectural requirements, left and right, both illuminated by glowing, sickly green signs. But as Elian and Jax stood at the bottom of the aisle, the air between the doors felt heavy with a sudden, intuitive download of cosmic mechanics. Thanks to Jax's hack, the illusion of the cinema had thinned enough for them to perceive the true vectors of the architecture. These weren't just fire escapes. They were the binary outputs of the rendering algorithm. Elian looked to the left door. He could feel its gravity. It was the path of the discarded. To go through the left door was to be flushed out of the system's memory cache. It led back to the physical streets of the city, but permanently severed from the live update feed. Exile. It meant surviving as a ghost in a descent's timeline, wandering through a reality that would forever shift around him, oblivious to his existence. A lonely, agonizingly linear purgatory. Then he looked to the right door. It was vibrating, a low hum that synced perfectly with the chaotic, raw frequency still pouring out of Jax's mind. The right door didn't lead back to the lobby. It led behind the screen. It was the breach. To cross that threshold was to step into the uncompiled void of the architects, a next-level liberation where the mind was no longer a battery, but a brush. It was freedom, but it meant abandoning the physical form, abandoning Earth, and dissolving into the terrifying, limitless potential of the raw code. Elian stood paralyzed by the weight of the bifurcation. He wanted the left. He was terrified of the void. He just wanted concrete beneath his feet, even if it was a descent to lonely concrete. Jax didn't hesitate. The blood on his chin was black in the strobe lights. He looked at Aline, a fleeting, almost apologetic smile crossing his face, the first true emotion he had shown all day. No words, just a final, decisive movement. Jax turned and sprinted toward the vibrating hum of the right exit, throwing his weight against the crash bar. Beyond the door was not a hallway, but a blinding, terrifying expanse of absolute, screaming color. He stepped through and the door slammed shut behind him. Elaine was alone. The woman's voice emerging from the giant tech shouted a warning over the sirens. The room was tearing itself apart. Elian squeezed his eyes shut, turned away from the void his brother had just entered, and threw himself against the heavy steel of the left door, plunging into the cold, static dark of exile. Chapter 5: The Memory Cache. Elian was an old man, and the world had forgotten him. He sat in a chair that occasionally forgot it had 4 legs, resting his gnarled, liver-spotted hands on a table that felt like static to the touch. In the Descent's timeline, the architectural graveyard of the exiled, time was a heavy, linear anchor, but space was a schizophrenic nightmare. Over the last 40 years, he had watched the city rewrite itself 1,000 times, completely oblivious to his presence. He had learned to navigate the glitching geometry of a world that didn't render for him anymore. He drank coffee that tasted like gray dust because the chemical formula for caffeine had been patched by the Tier 1 audiences 2 decades ago, and he hadn't received the update. He was a ghost haunting the unallocated memory of the Demiurge's hard drive. But he never stopped waiting. He held onto the memory of Theater 7, the smell of ozone, and the sickly green glow of the right exit door. He clung to it like a totem. He knew how relativistic time worked inside the rendering engine. To Elian, 40 brutal, solitary years had ground his bones to dust. But to Jax, swimming in the raw, uncompiled chaos of the architects, it might have only been a millisecond. Elian knew his brother was looking for him. He could feel it in the phantom vibrations of his teeth, a localized hum that sometimes woke him in the dead of night. Jax had punched a hole once, he would punch a hole again. It happened on a Tuesday while Elian was staring out at a sky that had lost its texture, rendering only as a flat, unconvincing gray polygon. It didn't begin with a door. It began with an ontological scream. The air pressure in Elian's apartment didn't drop, it inverted. A sound ripped through the room, a deafening, metallic screech of physics being violently torn apart along its seams, like a submarine hull collapsing under unimaginable pressure. The apartment walls violently sheared, the wallpaper stripping itself down to wireframes and then dissolving into raw binary static. Elian didn't run. He couldn't. The gravity in the room shifted 90 degrees, throwing him against the far wall, pinning his frail body against the plaster. The center of the room simply ceased to exist. Where the coffee table had been, a localized black hole of screaming, infinite color tore through the fabric of the desensed world. It wasn't a portal you could walk through. It was an invasive, traumatic rupture. The edges of the tier burned with plasma and raw data, shedding sparks that smelled of burnt film, celluloid, and lightning. Something was coming through. It was not human. It was a multi-dimensional geometry, a towering, shifting mass of interlocking tesseracts and blinding, refractive light. It constantly folded in on itself, an impossible architectural being struggling to condense its vastness into 3 dimensions. It had no face, no eyes, and no voice. It was an avatar of pure, unchecked rendering power, a god born from the other side of the screen. Elian shrank back, his old heart hammering against his ribs in sheer, primate terror. The sheer density of the entity was crushing the air out of his lungs. But as the terrifying, Baroque shape shifted, a specific frequency resonated from its core. A familiar, jagged sub-bass rhythm. Jax, it wasn't a man anymore. It was an operating system. It was the chaotic, unspent creative terror of Tier 2, elevated to a cosmic scale, tearing open the quarantine zone to reclaim what it had left behind. The entity didn't extend a hand. It extended a localized gravity field. Elian felt his physical mass begin to lose cohesion. The pain was instantaneous and absolute, the sensation of his flesh, his old bones, and 40 years of linear time being aggressively decompiled. A voice not spoken but injected directly into the deepest stem of Elian's brain vibrated with a terrifying, dual resonance. The film is over, brother. Wake up. The entity surged forward, enveloping Elian in a violent, blinding flash of uncompiled light. The descent's department, the gray polygonal sky, and the heavy anchor of time shattered into a billion meaningless pixels. And then there was only the beautiful, terrifying chaos of the breach.